So, we're going to talk about gene environment interactions now. And just a reminder, human traits are different than Mendelian traits in so many different ways. So, some of them are difficult to measure, which we'll see with this example. Some of them change over time. We'll see that too. Um, but the major difference, and something that has a significant impact in our ability to apply Mendelian genetics to human genetics is that traits are often influenced by multiple genes and environmental factors. And this relationship is bidirectional, it's very complex, and it's adaptive. And so, the other thing that we'll see with these traits is that some of them, but most of them are continuous. We also have more than two allelic variants. So the inheritance patterns aren't nice and neat, and the dominance recessive patterns aren't always clear. And then one gene can also influence multiple traits. And then the environment can also change the genotype, right? And so, but in this example, we're not talking about genetic mutations. We're really talking about environmental influences on gene expression. And so that would be more like epigenetics. So for most human traits, DNA does not contain a determinate genetic program from which we can predict phenotype. What does that mean? It means that genotype doesn't equal phenotype. It also means that gene isn't the book of life and the deterministic factor of, what we all become. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It's still important. Your DNA is important, but it just means that the environment is as much as a carrier of information as the DNA sequence. And so they both are important for shaping phenotype and as a source of information in trying to predict phenotype. So first example, freckles. All of these examples could be traits, they could be diseases. It just depends on how we define it. Freckles actually would be significant because people who get freckles tend to be a little bit more sensitive to sunshine and are at higher risk for things like skin cancer. So freckles, that's the phenotype we're looking at. That's the trait. The gene is MC1R. So there is one gene, single gene, super simple, right? Inheritance pattern is autosomal dominant. Okay. But there's variable expressions because it's influenced by other genes and the environment. So when you have a situation where the impact on phenotype depends on something else, then oftentimes you're going to have a gene environment interaction. And so having a particular variant of allele at the location of this gene, what is the impact on phenotype? Well, it depends because actually freckles aren't expressed unless you have sun exposure. And so what is the impact of the gene, of the mutation, of the variant? It depends. It depends on if there is an environmental exposure of sunshine. And what is the impact of sunshine or the environmental exposure on the gene or on the phenotype? Well, it depends. It depends on what gene you have. And so there we have this bidirectional relationship that really determines the phenotype. And it changes over time, right? The next one is going to be IQ, and we won't talk about all the issues with IQ, but let's just go with it for now. So the gene of interest is the FADS2. The function is that this is involved in fat metabolism, but it's related to this trait of intelligence. And so the environmental variable is breast milk, especially during infancy. And so one variant of this gene is actually associated with a higher IQ, but only in breastfed children. So our trait, our phenotype is intelligence. And so what is the impact of this particular genetic allele on the phenotype of intelligence? Well, it depends. It depends if they were on the environmental exposure and if they were breastfed as children. Okay, so what is the impact of breast milk on the trait? Well, it depends. It depends on which allele they have. Moving on to single gene disease. So PKU is one of those single gene diseases. This is one of the diseases that we screen for during the newborn period. Because if we act soon, we can potentially avoid the really devastating consequences. So this is really a metabolic disorder. There is an abnormal enzyme, which is a protein, right? So the gene of interest is PAH. The protein is the PAH protein, which is an enzyme. This mutation results in the inability to digest Phe. It has an inheritance pattern that is autosomal recessive. And babies who have PKU and who eat Phe are usually healthy at first, so they're born healthy, but then symptoms appear within a few months, and that might include slow growth, eczema, a smell, a body odor, small head size, fair skin, because Phe is converted into skin pigment. And without treatment, children with PKU experience developmental delays, behavioral problems, intellectual disabilities, and seizures. So, what are the phenotypic effects of this genetic mutation? It depends. It depends on the diet. Because if they are not exposed to Phe, and then they won't display the phenotype of the disease. And so what is the effect of diet on brain development? Well, it depends. It depends on if you have this mutation or not. And so this is one of the diseases where if a baby wasn't exposed to Phe and we didn't do genetic testing or anything, then you would never see the disease. It would never display. And so again, you have this very bidirectional relationship. So in the module, you guys covered the esophageal cancer relationship with ALDH2 gene. And so, again, this is a gene-environment interaction. So I'll skip this for now. Moving on to a more complex situation. So asthma is not a single gene disorder. Asthma is a super complex disorder, but there are genetic variations that might increase or decrease your risk of developing asthma. There are also environmental risk factors. And so the genes that we're going to talk about right now are the genes coding for enzymes that are pretty much like antioxidants, right? So they buffer against the oxidative stress. And so if these enzymes aren't functioning properly, then there's more damage that can be done because of oxidative stress. And so if you have one poorly functioning gene, you have a 50% increased risk of asthma. If you have both poorly functioning genes, your risk increases by 4 times. But then if you have both non-functioning or poorly functioning antioxidant genes, and you're exposed to air pollution, your risk increases by 9-fold. So this is just one example of how genetic susceptibilities can be exacerbated by environmental exposures. So in summary, genotype does not equal phenotype, not in humans. It's not that simple. So most traits are the result of complex interactions between multiple genes in combination with our environment and our lifestyles. Most traits have a really complex and unpredictable inheritance pattern. Remember, even if you have the nucleotide sequence, it doesn't mean that you're able to express that genetic sequence because of all of the different ways that we regulate that expression. And so it just appears to be really complex, and you don't always get the nice pedigrees that you do with pea plants. And then I just want to reiterate that traits can be adaptive or maladaptive depending on the environment. And we saw this with sickle cell, right? The inheritance pattern depended on which particular phenotype that you were looking for. But also, we see this protective factor with the exact same mutation. And so it really depends on the environment and how we define, what disease is. So Mendelian traits, genotype equals phenotype. Human traits, genotype influences but does not determine phenotype.